Redstone, Nevada. A Tuesday afternoon so hot the wood on the saloon porch had begun to warp. The batwing doors swung open. 3 men walked in, guns worn low. The whole room turned. The bartender found something urgent below the counter. 2 card players became fascinated with the hands they'd been dealt. The woman by the window pulled her shawl tighter. In heat that could blister skin, everyone looked except one. She sat in the corner, back to the wall, hands still mending a boot with an awl and a length of waxed thread. She didn't look up, didn't glance toward the door. And she should have looked, unless she already knew, unless she'd been watching that door before they ever arrived. The first man stopped. His eyes swept the room and stopped on the corner, outside. The gray horse tied near the door stamped once. Ears forward, he knew. He always knew. Redstone, Nevada. August 1882, a Tuesday afternoon so hot the wood on the saloon's front porch had started to warp. Not bend, not soften, warp. The kind of slow structural failure that happens when heat stops being weather and starts being a condition. When the air itself gives up on moving and just sits there, heavy and still, like a judgment that hasn't finished being delivered. Inside the Callaway saloon, 3 ceiling fans turned, slow as dying thoughts. Slow as men who've lost the argument but haven't admitted it yet. The air smelled of sawdust and sour rye, and the particular tension that collects in rooms where people have stopped, pretending everything is fine. The kind of tension you can't name until after something happens, and then you remember it was there all along. She was sitting in the corner, back to the wall, always the wall. Her name was Nora Weld, 58 years old. Gray hair pinned back without ceremony, the way a woman pins her hair when she stopped caring what it looked like years ago and never went back. A face that had seen enough weather, human and otherwise, to stop being surprised by either. She wore a green riding coat that had outlived 2 horses, 1 marriage, and more men than she cared to count. Brown hat, dust on the brim, dust on the coat, dust on the boots she was currently mending with an awl and a length of waxed thread. Not waiting, not watching, mending a boot. Because the boot needed mending. Because the world would keep spinning whether she hurried or not. Because 58 years of living in hard country teaches you that the only tasks worth doing are the ones in front of you, done properly, without rushing toward the ones that haven't arrived yet. Nobody in that room looked at her twice. Not the bartender. Not the 2 men at the far table playing cards with the focused disinterest of men killing time rather than enjoying it. Not the woman near the window who had gathered her shawl around her shoulders despite the heat, a gesture that meant something. But nobody was asking what. Nobody looked at Nora Weld twice. That was not an accident. That was 8 years of careful, deliberate, patient work. 8 years of learning to take up exactly as much space as necessary, and not 1 inch more. 8 years of training rooms to file her away as furniture. It was the most useful skill she had ever developed. More useful than speed. More useful than accuracy, more useful than the particular knowledge of how to read a man's shoulder before his hand moved. Outside, tied to the post nearest the door, stood a gray horse. Not silver, not white. The particular gray of river stone after rain has passed, and the stone has dried but not forgotten. 17 hands of quiet muscle and accumulated experience. Dust was his name. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. His ears were forward. Not looking for trouble, but he knew it was coming. He always knew. The batwing doors swung open at 2:30. 3 men. Dex Farrow came through first, 42 years old. A duster coat the color of old tobacco that had never been washed and didn't need to be. He had the build of a man who had done hard things for long enough that the hard things had stopped requiring effort. Lean in the way that isn't thinness but efficiency. His eyes moved the way a land surveyor's eyes move. Left to right. Corner to corner, methodical and complete, not looking for anything in particular. Looking for everything in general, just measuring. The way you measure a room before you decide what belongs in it. Behind him, Kit Howell. 21 years old, 2 guns, both worn low. Both worn deliberately low, the way a young man positions something when the entire purpose is for you to notice it. He had the jaw of someone whose face hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to be. The unfinished quality of a man who hasn't yet met the thing that would complete him, or end him. The 2 possibilities looking identical from the outside. Last through the door was August Pruitt, 34. quieter than the other two, in the way of a man who has learned that quiet is information. He positioned himself nearest to the exit, not to block it, to remember where it was. The particular instinct of a man who has been in enough bad rooms to always locate the door before he needs it. Smart. Farrow scanned the room. The bartender found something urgent to investigate below the counter. The two card players became fascinated with their hands. In the particular way of men who have decided their hands are the most interesting thing in the world. The woman by the window gathered her shawl tighter and moved toward the back with the unhurried certainty of someone who has made this calculation before and knows exactly how much time she has. Farrow's eyes moved left to right, corner to corner, and stopped. Most people, when three armed men walk through a door, look at those three armed men. It is a reflex older than thought, the body cataloging threat before the mind has formed the question. Head turning, eyes finding. The involuntary assessment of how afraid to be. Nora Weld had not looked up from her boot. That was what caught him, not her face. Not the green coat or the gray hair or anything that could be put on a piece of paper and described as identifying. What caught Dex Farrow was the absence. The missing reaction that every other person in the room had performed automatically, without choice, without knowing they were doing it. She hadn't looked, which meant she already knew, which meant she'd been watching the door before they arrived. He crossed the floor slowly. Not performing slowness, actually slow. The pace of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that hurrying is how people make the mistakes that end careers, or end other things. He pulled out the chair across from her. He sat. Nora set down her awl, finished the stitch she was on first, because the stitch needed finishing, because her hands didn't shake. Then she looked up. Her eyes were gray. The same gray as dust. The same gray as Nevada sky in the 10 minutes before weather makes up its mind. Not cold, not warm. Attentive in the way of eyes that have learned to treat everything as information and nothing as personal. That seat taken? Farrow said. It wasn't a question, it is now, she said. A pause settled between them, not awkward. More like the space between one note and the next, in a piece of music where the silence is doing as much work as the sound. Kit Howell and August Pruitt had arranged themselves to either side, left and right, hands loose near holsters, blocking exits without appearing to. The practiced choreography of men who have done this enough times that the choreography has become automatic. Nora noticed, filed it away, resumed her work. I'm going to say a name, Farrow said, and you're going to tell me if I have the right woman. You can say whatever you like, Nora replied. People usually do. Nora Weld. She didn't flinch. Didn't pause. Finished another stitch. Depends on who's asking. Man named Garrison Vale. Out of Carson Flats. Farrow reached inside his coat, placed a folded paper on the table between them, didn't push it toward her. Left it in the center, the way you leave something when you want the other person to understand you already have what you came for. He's posted $2,000. Says he wants you found. Nora placed her boot on the table. Deliberate. Small sound of worn leather on worn wood. She looked at the paper. Didn't touch it. 2,000, she said. He must what the man said. He didn't say what he thought, Farrow said. He said what he'd pay. He watched her the way a chess player watches the board when the other side has made a move that wasn't expected. Those aren't the same thing? No, Nora agreed. They aren't. Kit Howell shifted his weight. 21 years old. Already impatient. Already itching with the particular hunger of a young man who measures his worth in other men's reputations and keeps finding his own wanting. He had not yet understood that this deficit could not be corrected by speed. Heard about you, he said. Nora did not look at him. Kit took that as an invitation, because young men always did. Heard you were in Tonopah in 78. Heard 3 men went looking for somebody and only one came back. Heard the one that came back didn't talk much after. He paused, for effect. The practiced pause of a 21-year-old who has rehearsed this. They tell me you're the fastest woman in Nevada. Nora looked up. She looked at Kit Howell with the expression a school teacher reserves for a student who has delivered a wrong answer with complete conviction. Not unkind, not cruel. Just tired of the performance, son, she said. One word. Delivered quietly. Landing with wait than it had any right to. Kit's jaw tightened. I've been doing this since before you were shaving, she said. She picked up her awl. turned the boot over, examined a seam with the attention of a woman doing one thing at a time. "And I'll tell you the only thing about it worth knowing," she looked at him. "Speed gets you killed. Timing keeps you alive, that's so," Kit said. "Not a question. A refusal. Every person who ever drew on me drew fast," she said. "Most of them drew first." She set the boot down. Flat. Final. None of them drew last. The room sat with that. Even Pharaoh went still. The stillness of a man recalculating something he thought he already had figured. There was no theater in it, no attempt to intimidate, no performance of danger. The words arrived the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. Not with pleasure, not with cruelty. Just with the flat, factual weight of someone describing, this is what it is, this is what will happen. Make of that what you choose." Kit Howell made of it the thing he was always going to make of it. He heard a challenge. Because at 21, everything is a challenge. Everything is an opportunity to become the story. To be the name in the sentence that starts with "and nobody ever heard from him again." Except to be the one who delivered the ending, not received it. To be the answer to the question of who finally proved what speed could do when it met something that had gotten too comfortable with its own legend. He didn't think. That was the entire problem. Thought requires the genuine belief that you might be wrong. And Kit Howell, 21 years old, 2 guns, a reputation assembled from other people's fear and his own velocity. Kit Howell did not genuinely believe he could be wrong about anything that mattered. His right hand moved. Fast. Genuinely, honestly fast. The boy had speed. Give him that much. His hand moved with the kind of quickness that impresses people who haven't seen what quickness runs into when it meets something older and more patient. Nora Weld had not been watching his hands. She had been watching his right shoulder. The slight forward dip that preceded the draw, the weight shift. The breath taken and held. The body announcing its decision 3 seconds before the hand received the order. The body always announced it. Most people never learned to read the announcement. They were too busy watching hands. She had been reading that announcement since Kit Howell walked through the door one shot. Not fast the way Kit had been fast. Fast the way a surgeon's cut is fast. Not hurried, not frantic. Precisely as quick as necessary and not one fraction more. Her iron cleared leather while Kit's was still deciding, and the shot took him center left, which is the choice a trained hand makes when there is no room for anything less final. Kit Howell folded at the bar. Not dramatically. Not the way the stories went. He sat down against the wooden rail with his chin dropping to his chest, and he didn't move again, 21 years old. The age when a man still believes that being fastest and being right are the same thing. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. Nora turned to face the room. Iron still in her hand. A thin thread of smoke from the barrel. She didn't raise it toward anyone. She held it the way you hold something you haven't finished kneading yet. She looked at August Pruitt. He had his weapon halfway out. Their eyes met. He stopped. The saloon went quiet the way saloons go quiet after a shot. Not silence exactly. The absence of everything unnecessary. Somewhere a glass was still resonating. Outside, dust stamped once on the hard ground, once only. The sound of a horse that had heard gunfire before and was telling his rider he was still there. Nora looked at August Pruitt for a moment. "You have a family?" she said. He blinked. "What family?" "Wife, children. Somebody waiting somewhere." His hand near the holster didn't know what to do with itself. It had been prepared for an entirely different kind of conversation. "A daughter," he said finally, smaller than he meant to say it. Back in Provo, Nora holstered her gun. "Go home to your daughter," she said. August Pruitt stood there for 3 seconds, the expression of a man who has just been handed something he doesn't know how to hold. Not relief alone. Not gratitude alone. Something more complicated than both. The particular feeling of a man who has just understood something about himself that he will need a long time alone to finish working out. Then he backed toward the door, turned, gone. The batwing doors swung twice and then were still, which left Dex Pharaoh. He had not moved during any of it. Had remained exactly as placed, hands flat on the table, watching with the careful attention of a man who has decided not to be part of the story he is witnessing. He was good. The kind of good that was uncomfortable to acknowledge, because you did not want the man across from you to be that good. It made things complicated. Nora looked at Pharaoh. He looked at her. "You're not going to run," he said. Not a question. No, Vale has more men than me. I expect he does. You could be in California in 3 days. New name. New territory. His voice had the flat quality of a man reciting options he already knows the answers to. Man like Garrison Vale. He's got enough concerns. He'd probably let it go. Man like Garrison Vale. Nora said, doesn't let anything go. That's how he got to be a man like Garrison Vale. Farrow was quiet for a moment. You know him. Not surprise. Confirmation. The closing of a question he'd already halfway answered. I know what he did, she said. She picked up her boot again. The seam wasn't finished. Work left undone was work left undone. And he knows I know it. That's why I'm worth $2,000 to him. Farrow looked at his hands on the table. Then at the corner of the room where Kit Howell was still arranged against the bar rail, not moving, never going to move again. Then back at Nora. What did he do? Farrow said. And there it was, the question under the question. The real one. Not the professional inquiry of a man running a job. The personal one. The one that didn't belong in a professional conversation at all and had arrived anyway. Nora looked at him, not with suspicion, with assessment. The measuring of a woman who has learned that information is a currency with its own exchange rates, and you don't spend it before you understand the value. Why, she said slowly, would that matter to you? Farrow's hands came off the table, clasped together. The posture of a man preparing to say something he doesn't say easily or often. My brother died in Tonopah, he said, 1871. A man named Clement Farrow. He met her eyes and held them. Shot behind the freight office on a Tuesday in October. Nobody ever found out why. Nobody ever found out who. A pause. Small, precise. I've been looking off and on for 11 years. Nora went very still. Not the stillness before movement. The stillness of a body that has just absorbed something unexpected and hasn't yet decided what to do with it. I didn't know your brother, she said carefully. I know, Farrow said. His voice hadn't changed registers. Still the professional surface. Still the flat, controlled tone of a man who has kept himself carefully at the surface of things for a long time and has gotten very good at it. But the man who hired me to find you, Garrison Vale, his name keeps showing up in the same places my brother's death shows up. Never direct. Never provable, just adjacent, he looked at her. I want to know why. The saloon was quiet around them. Outside, dust stamped again, patient. Present, Nora looked at Dex Farrow for a long time. The kind of looking that checks the load-bearing elements of a thing. Tests whether it will hold the weight of what you're considering putting on it. Whether the person presenting themselves is the same as the person underneath. Then she reached into her coat. He didn't move, good. She pulled out an envelope. Worn at the edges. The paper soft from years of handling. She placed it on the table between them. Didn't push it toward him. Left it in the center, the same way he'd left the wanted notice. Equidistant, I've been carrying that for 8 years, she said. What's in it is what I know. What I can prove. A pause. Or what I could prove. Before Vale arranged for his nephew to sit in the Federal Circuit judge's chair in Carson Flats, Farrow looked at the envelope. Didn't touch it yet. Why are you showing me this? I'm not showing you anything, Nora said. I'm leaving something on a table. What you do with it is your business. She picked up her boot, resumed her mending. Farrow reached out and picked up the envelope. He didn't open it there. Not in a saloon with a dead man at the bar rail and 2 empty chairs where his people used to be. He tucked it inside his coat and stood. Replaced the chair with the deliberate care of a man raised to leave places as he found them. He looked at her. The boy, he said, meaning Kit Howell. He drew first, she said, in front of at least 4 people, the ones too scared to leave. Give the undertaker my name if he needs it. Farrow nodded. The nod of a man accepting terms he didn't set but finds acceptable. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, didn't turn back, just stood with one hand on the batwing door, looking at the street beyond it. My brother, he said, Clement. He was 24 years old. Nora kept her eyes on her boot. Her hands kept moving, the awl going through the leather. The thread pulling taut. I heard about it, she said quietly. At this time, a long pause. Did Vale do it? I don't know, she said, but I think he knows who did. The batwing doors swung open, closed, then nothing. Nora sat alone in the corner of the Callaway Saloon on a Tuesday afternoon in August 1882 and finished mending her boot. The bartender materialized from wherever bartenders go when death visits, pale, sweating, but functional, and poured her a glass of rye without being asked. She looked at her boot. The seam was clean. Even. The kind of work that holds. She reached for the glass and drank. Outside, through the warped saloon window, she could see Dust at the post. He had turned his head toward the glass, ears forward. Watching, she put 2 fingers to her temple. A salute he couldn't see, and she didn't need him to. He was still there. That was enough. She reached into her coat pocket, not the pocket with the gun, the other one. Produced a second envelope, thicker than the one she'd left on the table for Pharaoh, heavier with 8 years of collected weight. Documents, affidavits. A statement from a dying man in Elko who had seen something in 1869 and had spent 14 years trying to decide if the guilt of silence was preferable to the danger of speaking. He had finally decided it was not. The plan had been simple. Walk into Carson Flats. Find the federal circuit judge. Not the county man, the one whose appointment came from Washington and not from influence, and present the documents. Let the machinery of law do what the machinery of law was built to do, because that was what Thomas would have wanted, Thomas Weld. Her husband. 30 years on the bench in Elko County, the best man she had personally known. Dead on the floor of his office in 1869, with a bullet in him and his land documents missing from the desk he'd sat behind for 2 decades. She had wanted to do it his way. For 13 years, she had wanted to do it his way. And now the circuit judge in Carson Flats was Garrison Vale's nephew. Had been for 6 months, quietly appointed. The kind of appointment that doesn't make noise, because the people who arranged it understood that noise was the only thing that could stop it. She had been building toward the wrong door. For 8 years. The rye went down wrong, and right at the same time, she set the glass down, put on her hat, picked up her saddlebag from the floor beside her chair. Moved toward the door, paused at the threshold and turned back. "The boy," she said to the bartender. "He have family anywhere?" The bartender shook his head. Rode in alone from Utah Territory. "That's all I knew of him." She reached into her coat. Put $3 on the nearest table. Enough for a burial and a marker and a little left over. "See he gets put in the ground properly," she said, and walked out into the afternoon glare. Dust was exactly where she'd left him. Head up. Eyes on the street. The calm authority of a horse that has never panicked when it wasn't warranted and has developed strong opinions about when it is. She put her palm flat on his neck. He exhaled through his nose, dropped his head slightly. She untied the reins and mounted. To the north, somewhere between her and the mountains, Carson Flats was doing what it always did in the afternoon heat. Moving money, making decisions, maintaining the comfortable fiction that the men who ran things had earned the right to run them. Garrison Vale had an office there, a house. Connections running sideways and upward and in every direction that mattered. She had an envelope of documents. A circuit judge related to the problem, and the particular patience of a woman who has waited 13 years and understands, at a cellular level, that one more day is not the same thing as giving up. It is just one more day. She turned Dust north. He found his pace, easy, ground covering. The stride of an animal that has stopped making the distinction between hurrying and moving, and has come to understand that the only thing that matters is the arriving. 15 miles to Carson Flats. One closed door, and somewhere behind it, another door she hadn't tried yet. There was always another door. Thomas had believed that. She intended to find out if he was right. 8 miles south of Carson Flats. The desert stopped pretending, no scrub. No shade, no courtesy, just flat hardpan running toward the mountains like a debt that had stopped accruing interest because the lender had given up on ever being paid. The kind of country that has no opinion about what you're carrying. Your grief or your documents or your 13 years of careful patience. The desert receives all of it with equal indifference and continues being the desert. Dust moved through it the way he moved through all hard country. Without drama, without complaint. The long, easy stride of an animal that has been traveling long enough to stop measuring miles and start measuring something else. Something that doesn't have a name in any language. She let him choose the pace. She always did, 3 hands of sun above the ridge when she made camp in a dry wash 4 miles south of town. Not because she was tired. Because arriving somewhere you don't know well enough, in the dark, at the end of a day that had already been eventful, That was how you made the last mistake of a long story. Thomas had told her that he'd been talking about cases at the time. The same principle applied. She built a fire, small, efficient, the fire of someone who needs heat and light and nothing ceremonial. Hardtack. Canned beans cold from the saddlebag. Coffee strong enough to keep a dead man honest. She ate without tasting. Drank without pleasure. A purely functional relationship with food that develops when the body is fuel and you are the engine, and there is distance left to cover. Dust stood unhaltered nearby. Free to go the way he was always free to go, he never did. She sat with what was left of the coffee and let her mind do what minds do when the body goes still. Revisit, circle back, pick at the seams to see what holds. Kit Howell, 21 years old, against the bar rail of the Callaway Saloon. That weight had already settled into its permanent place alongside the others. Necessary, final, not clean. He had drawn first. That was a fact. He had drawn first because he was 21 and believed that being fastest was the same as being right, and nobody in his life had arranged for him to discover otherwise, before it cost him everything. She hoped the $3 covered a marker with his name on it. August Pruitt. Somewhere north on the road to Provo. She was almost certain he was going. The man who figures out what he needs to figure out goes home. She had seen it before. The decision that looks like turning around but is actually the first time going in the right direction. She hoped the daughter was awake when he got there. She hoped the girl ran at him from across a room. Dex Farrow. Riding with an envelope tucked inside his coat, and 11 years of grief that had just been handed a new address. She thought about that the most, because Farrow was the variable she couldn't fully calculate. A professional man with a personal reason and a paid obligation and a piece of information that was currently rearranging everything inside him. He could go either direction. He could deliver what he knew to Vale and collect his money. He could ride toward the answer, the envelope suggested, and forget about the money. He could do both simultaneously, the way a man can be reconsidering everything while still doing the job, the two processes running parallel, neither one canceling the other. She didn't know which direction Farrow would go. She knew she couldn't wait to find out. The fire burned low. She covered the coals, pulled her bedroll, and lay back the desert sky above her. Stars in the density that only appears when there's no competing light for 50 miles in any direction. The particular enormity of a sky that has been there longer than any human concern and will continue after every human concern has resolved itself one way or another. There was a star directly above her, Polaris, motionless while everything else wheeled around it. Thomas had pointed it out to her on the night they married, standing outside the church in Elko in December of 1858. 24 years old, and already the kind of man who believed that fixed points were worth locating and worth keeping. She had loved him for that. Still did, not the version of love that hurts, the other version, the one that becomes structural after enough time and enough absence. Not a wound anymore. Foundation. The thing underneath everything else that explains why you're still standing when the list of reasons to stop has gotten very long. She closed her eyes. Sleep came eventually, not the good kind, the functional kind, the kind that gets the body to morning. She woke at 4 a.m. from a dream she didn't remember and didn't need to. Desert sky. Still dark. Still enormous. Dust standing 10 feet away with his head turned toward her. "I know," she said to him. He exhaled through his nose. She made no fire, no coffee. Rolled the bedroll, loaded the saddlebag, put on her hat and mounted in the dark. One action. Then the next. The habit of 13 years of waking up in places that weren't home and continuing anyway. Not because it was easy. Because it was what you did. Dust moved north without prompting. He always knew north. The sky lightened by degrees. Gray first. Then the particular 10-minute pink that exists only at the leading edge of a Nevada sunrise. The color of something rare that hasn't decided yet how long it intends to stay. Then gold. Then the flat, uncompromising blue of a day that has made up its mind. Hot. Unrelenting. Fine. She had ridden in worse. She was 3 miles south of Carson Flats when she heard the horse, one horse, coming fast. From the north, angling across the hardpan toward her, in the way of a horse being pushed harder than the distance required. She didn't reach for her gun. She pulled Dust to a stop and waited, because real threats didn't always announce themselves the same way. Sometimes a threat was one rider moving at pace across empty country. The only way to know what kind of threat, or whether it was one at all, was to stop and let it arrive and see what it did. She waited. Dust's ears went forward. The rider came into focus. August Pruitt. Of course it was. She said nothing. He pulled up 6 feet away. His horse was blowing hard. He'd been riding since Redstone, it looked like. Since the moment she'd told him to go home to his daughter. And he'd apparently decided that going home to his daughter was going to require a detour through some things he hadn't finished yet. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You were supposed to go to Provo," she said. "I know, your daughter is in Provo, I know that too." Then, "The federal circuit judge in Carson Flats," he said. "The one you're taking your documents to." She went still. "His name is Clement Vale," August said. "Garrison Vale's nephew. Appointed in March." The appointment came from Washington, technically, but Washington was asked to make it by a senator from Nevada who owes Garrison Vale more than he'll ever be able to repay. The words landed the way confirmed suspicions always land. Not like news, like recognition. The specific weight of a thing you suspected being given its name. She didn't let it show. "I know," she said. August blinked. "You know, I found out in Redstone, before your group arrived to complicate my afternoon." "Then why?" "Because I was working through it," she said. "Not sharp, exact." The tone of a woman who has been working through things for 13 years and has become efficient at it. One closed door isn't the end of the options. It's the beginning of finding the next one. He looked at her for a moment. Reassessing. "There's more," he said. She waited. "Farrow contacted Vale last night. Sent a rider ahead of you." August's horse shifted. He let it settle. "Vale knows you're coming. He's added men to the house. 4 more than he had yesterday." She did the arithmetic. She had always planned to watch the house before entering it. That hadn't changed. What changed was the geometry. 4 additional men meant 4 additional positions, 4 additional gaps in the pattern, 4 additional seconds of recalculation required before the 40-second window in the rotation opened. Harder. "Not impossible," Farrow told him, she said. "Yes, I know why," she said. Before August could fill in his version, a man can be reconsidering everything he believes and still complete the job he was paid for. Those 2 processes run simultaneously. One doesn't stop the other. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. She turned Dust slightly north, studying the line of mountains above Carson Flats. "I've known men like Farrow. They're not complicated. They have a job and a grief, and they're trying to work out which one is going to determine the other. That takes time." A pause. "More time than we have this morning." August was quiet for a moment. Then, "So what do we do?" She looked at him. He had said "we" without deciding to. The word that arrives before the permission. "Why are you here?" she said. Not unkind. Direct. The question she hadn't asked first because she already knew the shape of the answer and wanted to hear him say it in his own words. August looked at the ground between their horses. Then at her. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's going to grow up in this territory. In whatever Nevada becomes when it decides what it is." He stopped. Started again. Quieter. "I don't want her growing up in a place where a man like Garrison Vale doesn't pay for what he does. Where a man can buy a judge and hire 3 people to bring in a woman who has proof of what he did. And it works, because nobody was willing to stand in the space between what's right and what's comfortable." He looked at her steadily. "My father made choices when I was young that I didn't understand for years. Then I got older and I understood them, and I was glad he'd made them." A pause. "I want her to be glad, the desert around them. Hot and patient and present." She thought about Thomas. About what Thomas would have said, about a man who turned around in the dark for a 7-year-old girl he was trying to be worth. He would have liked August Pruitt. She was almost certain of it. "You could be killed," she said. "Yes. Your daughter needs her father." Yes, he didn't look away. "And she needs to live in a country where this kind of thing gets answered for." Those 2 things are both true. They don't resolve cleanly. A pause. "I've made my peace with that." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was full up now, hot on her left shoulder. The day had committed to scorching. 4 more men," she said finally. "Yes, professionals?" "Hired men. Vale keeps people on payroll. Not like Farrow." He paused. "Farrow won't be there." "I know," she said it before he could qualify it. "He's somewhere between the saloon and the answer the envelope pointed him toward." He's not going to complicate his direction by inserting himself between two people who have more reason than he does. August thought about that. What's the plan? He said. Same purpose. Different approach. She turned dust to face north again, the valley, the town. The house at the north end of Carson Flats, where a 60-year-old man was currently adding guards and waiting for news he wasn't going to like. I go in. I make Vale understand that whatever protection he thinks he has isn't protection anymore. I give him the chance to end it, and if he doesn't, then every document I have, every affidavit, every statement, every piece of paper built over 8 years goes to a newspaper, to the federal marshal's office in San Francisco, to the senator from Nevada who is not on Garrison Vale's list. A pause. It's the slower path. But it works. You've been holding that option back. It was the last option, Shah said. I wanted to give the legitimate path a genuine chance first. She looked at him. Thomas deserved that. August was quiet. Your husband, he said. Not a question. Just the name finding its place in the shape of everything she'd said. He was a judge, she confirmed. He believed in the process even when the process was difficult. She looked north again. I've been trying to honor that. Even with a compromised appointment sitting in the federal chair, they rode north together, not fast. The pace of people who understand that arriving correctly matters more than arriving first. Carson Flats announced itself with the pragmatic accumulation of structures that said people had decided to stay here and built what they could. Not beautiful. Functional. The architecture of permanence without pretension. She had been here once before. 1877. Keeping her head down. Riding past Garrison Vale's house without stopping because the documents weren't ready, and the dying man in Elko hadn't died yet, and you don't bring something to a fight before it's ready. She had told herself, not yet. She had been right about that and wrong about what was waiting at the destination. They stopped at the south edge of town. We split here, Nora said. August looked at her. I go in. You stay out. She faced him directly. Not a request. Not quite an order. The calm statement of someone who has thought further into this situation than the conversation has yet traveled. If I'm not back by nightfall, you take everything you know and ride to the telegraph office in Elko. Wire the name Garrison Vale to the federal marshal in San Francisco. Tell them a woman came to Carson Flats with documents and didn't come back out. That's your contingency. That's always been my contingency. She met his eyes. Plan A is I walk back out. He almost smiled. The near smile of a man who has just committed to trusting something he can't fully verify and is accepting that. She turned dust toward the north road and rode. She rode north through Carson Flats on a gray horse at an easy, unremarkable pace, past the dry goods store, past the assay office, past two men outside a bank, who paused to watch a woman on a gray horse go by, and then continued their conversation, because there was nothing in that sight worth interrupting for. The house at the north end was exactly as she'd filed it years ago. Solid frame construction, stone foundation, a covered porch running the full length of the front face. Solid, intentional. The structure of a man who had decided this was where he was staying and built accordingly. Two men on the porch, standing in the posture of men being paid to stand without being told specifically why today requires more of them. She counted the additional 4 as she passed. 2 at the east corner. 1 on the roof of the adjacent building, not as invisible as he believed. 1 near the stable, trying to look like someone's employee without quite managing which employee. Not professionals. August had been right. They had the threatening aspect down and the attention less well developed. She didn't slow, didn't look directly. Continued past and turned left 2 blocks north. Came around behind through the thin stand of cottonwoods on the property's west side. She left dust a quarter mile out. No rope. Far enough from the road that a horse's instinct to remain would serve better than any knot. Then she moved on foot. Shadow to shadow. 30 years of hard country had given her a body that knew how to be quiet, not trained. Developed the way all survival skills develop, through the repeated experience of needing them. Through arriving at the understanding that noise was information and silence was strategy. The back door. Unlocked. Of course it was unlocked. Men who pay for guards rarely think about the spaces. Guards can't see. They invest in the visible solution and then stop thinking. The particular blindness of people who believe that sufficient expenditure resolves sufficient problems. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Let her eyes adjust. Let the house tell her what it could. Parlor ahead. Lamp burning low. A chair turned toward the front window, angled to watch the south road. A desk to the left. Papers. A glass of amber whiskey, half finished. The kind of glass that gets poured when a man needs to occupy his hands while his mind works. Case beyond that. She crossed to the parlor, sat in the chair that faced the front window, and waited. Because that was the thing that none of them, not Kit Howell with 2 guns, not the 8 men on the perimeter, not even Dex Farrow with 15 years of professional competence and 11 years of grief. None of them had properly accounted for. Nora Weld was willing to be inconvenient longer than they expected. She had been inconvenient for 13 years. 10 more minutes was nothing. She heard him on the stairs at 9:15, not cautious, not guarded. The ordinary footsteps of a man descending to his own parlor at the end of an evening, expecting to find it as he left it. He came around the corner, stopped. Garrison Vale was 60 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way of men who did hard physical work in their youth and never entirely let the body forget it. Gray at the temples. A face built for authority, not handsome but structured, composed. The kind of face that had spent 3 decades expecting rooms to rearrange themselves upon entry. He looked at her. He looked at the chair. He looked at the door. He looked at her. She watched him run the calculation. Distance to the hallway, distance to the desk, distance to wherever he kept the thing he would reach for, if reaching were viable. She watched him understand that all of those distances were wrong. "Mr. Vale," she said. His voice, when it came, was steadier than most men's would have been. "The guards," he said. "Are fine," she said. "I left them at their posts." A pause. "This isn't their problem." He looked at the doorway behind him, then at her, the calculation still running. The slow adjustment of a patient man discovering that someone had been more patient. "Mrs. Weld," he said. "Nora," she said. "We're past the courtesy." He stood very still. "You've come a long way," he said. 13 years, she agreed. Relatively speaking, the ride from Redstone was nothing. Something moved across his face. Not quite appreciation. Not quite respect. The flicker of a man who recognizes, against his own interests, a well-constructed argument. He moved to the chair across from her, deliberate, unhurried, and sat. Which was interesting because he could have called for the men on the porch. Could have tried the desk. Could have done any number of things available to a 60-year-old man with resources and influence. And 8 hired men on his property on a Tuesday evening. He sat down, which meant he had something to say, which meant this conversation was not going to be the conversation she had prepared for. She put her hands flat on her knees and looked at him. "You want something," he said. The flat acknowledgement of a man who has conducted enough negotiations to know that people who go to significant trouble to arrive somewhere always want something. "I want the truth," she said. He almost smiled, the near expression of a man who has heard that sentence many times across a long career and has developed opinions about it. "Short sentence," he said. "Long ambition, I have time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached inside his coat. She didn't move. He produced an envelope, white, sealed with wax that had been pressed with a ring or a seal. The prepared gesture of a man who has been waiting for this specific conversation long enough to have made arrangements for it in advance. "I expected you in 1877, he said. He placed the envelope on the table between them. She looked at it. "Didn't reach for it. I wasn't ready," she said. "You were ready." He looked at his own hands, folded on the table. "You were in Carson Flats. I had someone watching the South Road. You rode past. The documents weren't complete." The documents, he said it without mockery, with something closer to respect which was its own kind of uncomfortable. Thomas's wife, spending 8 years building a legal case. He looked at her. He would have. "Don't," she said, flat, final. He stopped. Good. There were things she would discuss in this room tonight. There were things she would not. Garrison Vale, speaking about Thomas in any register that resembled familiarity, was in the second category. She needed him to understand that quickly and completely. He nodded once, accepting the limit. "Open it," he said. She picked up the envelope, broke the wax, unfolded the paper inside. The lamp burned beside her. The house sat quiet. She read. Then read it again. Then put the paper on the table between them and looked at Garrison Vale with an expression she could feel on her face and couldn't entirely prevent. because it was not what she expected. Not a confession. Not a justification. Not the elaborate self-exoneration of a man buying his way out of a reckoning. It was a land document, Thomas Weld's signature. February 1869. 4 months before he died, a sale. The Weld land in Elko County. Transferred to Garrison Vale. Signed. Witnessed. Notarized by a man whose notary stamp she recognized, which was impossible, because Thomas had never sold that land. She had been there. She had sat at the kitchen table and listened to him fight for that land through 3 separate legal challenges over 7 years. She had made the coffee and heard him work the arguments out loud, the way he always worked arguments. Pacing, talking to himself, stopping to write things down. He had never sold it, which meant the signature was false, which meant or the thought arrived sideways, without invitation, into the space between what she was certain of and what she could prove, expanding before she could stop it. Or she didn't know everything she thought she knew about Thomas Weld. "It's real," Vale said, quietly, the voice of a man not trying to win something. "I know how it looks. I know what you're thinking. I had 3 separate document examiners look at it over the years. Not men I paid for a particular result. Men I paid for the truth." She looked at the document again, Thomas's handwriting. She had been reading that handwriting for 24 years. She knew the particular weight of the pen on his downstrokes, the small loop he made without thinking at the base of the D in Weld, the way he crossed his T with a slight leftward lean. All of it there, all of it exactly right. She put the document down, breathed. "That doesn't change what happened to him," she said. "No," Vale said. "It doesn't. He's still dead, yes. And I still benefited from his death." He said it before she could. Not rushing, stating. The flat admission of a man who has spent 30 years knowing this sentence existed and understanding there was no path around it. The land transferred because the sale was already documented. The transition was clean, too clean. I knew it at the time. I told myself the document was genuine and the timing was coincidence. He stopped. "You didn't believe that," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't. The house was very quiet. Patent men, when they finally say the thing they have been not saying, say it without decoration, without the elaborate scaffolding of self-justification that smaller men build around their admissions." He had known. He had taken the land. He had told himself a story that he didn't believe. "Who killed him?" she said. Garrison Vale looked at the table. "I don't know his name," he said. "That's the truth. I have been trying to find it for 11 years. She looked at him. "Why 11 years?" she said. He reached into a different pocket, produced a smaller piece of paper, old, soft with age. He placed it beside the land document. She picked it up, a letter addressed to Garrison Vale, October 1871, unsigned. 3 sentences. "The judge asked too many questions about the transfer. It has been handled. Don't ask questions yourself if you want to keep what you have." She read it 3 times. 3 times, because 3 times was what it took for the full weight of it to reach the bottom. Anaconda. "Someone killed Thomas because he started asking questions about his own land sale," she said. "Yes. And they wrote to you to make sure you understood the warning." "Yes. And you kept quiet." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The answer was in the house around them, the solid frame, the stone foundation, the 30 years of building on ground that someone else had cleared by methods he had chosen not to examine. She put the letter down beside the land document, 2 pieces of paper, 13 years. The lamp guttered once in a draft. Steadied. She thought about Thomas at the kitchen table, reading, lips moving on the complicated passages. The best man she had personally known. Dead because he had done the thing he was constitutionally incapable of not doing, because he had found something that didn't add up and refused to leave it that way. Someone had handled it. And Garrison Vale had kept quiet. And Nora had spent 13 years pointing herself at the wrong door. She sat with that, let it be the size it was without making it smaller or larger. Dex Farrow. She said, finally. Vale looked up. "His brother," she said. "Clement Farrow, Tonopah." October 1871. Something shifted in Vale's face. The recognition of a man who has been carrying 2 things in separate rooms for 11 years and has just been told they were always the same thing. "The freight office," he said. "That's where they found him." Vale closed his eyes, briefly, then opened them. The letter came 6 days after Clement Farrow was found. He said, I never connected them. He was a freight clerk. I couldn't understand why anyone would. Because he saw something, Nora said. Or knew something. Or was in the wrong place when someone needed there to be no witnesses to what had happened. The room sat with that. 2 deaths. One hand, 4 days apart in the doing, 11 years apart in the telling. And somewhere between Redstone and Carson Flats, Dex Farrow was riding with an envelope. And 11 years of grief and a slowly turning understanding that the man who had hired him might be adjacent to the answer he'd been looking for. Then she heard the front door. Not a knock. Not an announced entry. The shift in air pressure that a house makes when a door that was closed is no longer closed. Vale heard it too. They looked at each other. Neither moved for exactly 1 second. Then Nora's hand went to her iron, and Dex Farrow walked into the parlor. He looked at Nora, then at Vale, then at the 2 pieces of paper on the table between them, then at Nora again. He was not holding his weapon, but his hand was near it. The automatic proximity of a man whose hands had been close to that particular thing for 15 years. Farrow, Nora said, Mrs. Weld. You told him I was coming. I did. No apology. No performance of regret. The flat acknowledgement of a professional man accounting for a professional decision. I was hired to do a job, and now? He looked at Vale for a long moment. Now I'm wondering, he said, whether the man who hired me is the man I should still be working for. Vale went very still, because that sentence had weight. Specific weight, the weight of a man who has read what was in an envelope, who has been writing for hours with that reading sitting against his chest, who has arrived at a question he has been not asking for 11 years, and has decided that tonight is when it gets asked. My brother, Farrow said to Vale, directly. The way a man speaks when he has not rehearsed anything and is simply saying the thing. Clement Farrow, Tonopah, October 1871. Vale looked at him. I know that name, Vale said. Tell me how. The lamp. The quiet house. 3 people in a parlor at the north end of Carson Flats, Nevada. The particular weight of the things between them adding up to more than any of them had carried individually. Vale told him. All of it. The land document. Thomas's questions. The letter. 6 days. The freight office. The way 2 things Vale had kept in separate mental drawers for 11 years were apparently the same thing, just seen from different angles, by different people who had never been in the same room before tonight. Farrow listened without moving, without expression. The stillness of a man receiving the thing he has been looking for and discovering. It comes packaged with more information than he anticipated, in a shape he wasn't expecting, with weight distributed in places he hadn't prepared to carry. When Vale finished, Farrow was quiet for a long moment. You suspected they were connected, he said. I suspected, Vale said. I couldn't prove it. You suspected, and you kept quiet. Yes, for 11 years, yes. The word sat in the room by itself. Farrow looked at Nora. She looked at him. Between them on the table, the land document, the unsigned letter, 13 years of hers and 11 years of his, and the accumulated arithmetic of 2 people who had been moving in parallel directions toward the same answer and had only now arrived at the same room. Who sent the letter? Farrow said. To Vale. I don't know the name. You tried to find it? Yes, Vale said. In the beginning. Carefully. The kind of inquiry you conduct when you understand that asking the wrong question in the wrong direction will get you the same result Thomas Weld got. He looked at his hands, and then I stopped, because you were afraid. Because I was afraid, Vale said, without deflection, without the layered self-justification of a man trying to make his fear sound reasonable. Just the plain admission of what it was, because stopping felt like survival. Because I convinced myself survival was sufficient. A pause. It wasn't sufficient, he said. I've known that for a long time. Nora looked at the 2 pieces of paper on the table. She looked at what she had come here to do, what she had spent 13 years preparing to do, the documents in her saddlebag, the affidavits, the dying man's statement, the carefully built architecture of proof, assembled stone by stone over 8 years, all of it aimed at the man sitting across from her, and now Garrison Vale sitting there. Not the source of what happened to Thomas, but the beneficiary. Not the hand that pulled the trigger, but the man who had heard the shot and understood what it meant and chosen to remain silent and keep what the silence preserved for him. Not innocent. Nobody in this room was innocent, but not the name she needed. She needed a name. You said you tried to find it, she said. Before you stopped. What did you find? He was quiet for a moment, the consideration of a man deciding how much of what he knows is safe to say out loud. Then he stood, moved to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, produced a folder. Old. The corners worn soft with age. He placed it on the table next to the other documents. Everything I found before I stopped looking, he said. Names. Dates. A connection to a land company that operated out of San Francisco, starting in the late 1860s. Men who were quietly assembling Elko County land in pieces, buying adjacent parcels one by one until the combined holdings would be worth far more than the sum of what they'd paid for each piece individually. He looked at Nora. Thomas's land was one of the pieces they needed to complete the picture. She opened the folder. Farrow moved to stand behind her. Not with her. Not exactly. Reading over her shoulder. The same words, different angle. 3 names listed as company principals. 2 of them dead, dates noted in Vale's careful handwriting in the margins, the manner of death not specified but the implication present. The 3rd name still alive, still operating, a man named Harlan Goss, based out of Sacramento now, former operations throughout Nevada territory. A man who had spent 3 decades moving from one jurisdiction to the next, accumulating land and influence through methods that stayed precisely adjacent to provability. Just outside the reach of men like Thomas Weld, who had the habit of asking questions and the authority to demand answers. Just adjacent. Always just adjacent. Nora's finger rested on the name. She felt something shift. The target she had moving toward for 13 years had just redirected itself. The reckoning she had built toward was still necessary, but it pointed somewhere different than she'd been aiming. The man she had come here to hold accountable was sitting across the table with a folder of evidence and 30 years of guilt. And the look has been waiting for someone to arrive and take the weight he'd been carrying wrong. Not absolution, not forgiveness, just the transfer of a burden to someone better positioned to do something with it. She looked at Farrow. He was looking at the name, his jaw set. The particular set of a jaw holding something the rest of the face isn't ready to show. Harlan Goss. He said, "You know him," she said. "I know the name. Sacramento, land acquisition. He's operated in Nevada before." He straightened. "I know a federal marshal in San Francisco. Used to work this territory. Good man. The specific kind of good that doesn't get bought. You're certain." "I'm certain of the things I need to be certain of," he said. "That's one of them." She looked at Vale. "The folder," she said. "It's yours," he said. "It's been yours for a long time. I just didn't know the right way to get it there." She took it, added it to what she already had. The documents, the affidavits, the dying man's testimony, all of it still relevant. Because Vale had still kept quiet, had still benefited, had still let Thomas's death fold into the silence and stay there, undisturbed for 13 years. Not the whole story, but a necessary part of it. She looked at Vale. "You're not walking out of this clean," she said. "I know that. What happened to Thomas? What happened to Clement Farrow? You knew things. You said nothing." "Yes, that's going to matter. I expect it will." He met her eyes. Held them. "I stopped expecting clean a long time ago. He stopped. "I stopped expecting this either. Someone actually arriving." A pause. "Most of the time, the things we carry alone until we die, and the weight dies with us. Nobody comes. Not this time," she said. "No," he said. "Not this time." Farrow looked at Nora. "The marshal in San Francisco," he said. "I can make contact. Get him moving on Goss before Goss knows the direction has shifted. The calculation of a man repurposing a specific set of professional skills toward a different objective. The same skills, different direction. It'll take 2 weeks. Maybe 3. I have time," she said. Something moved across Farrow's face, not a smile, the predecessor of one. The expression of a man who has arrived somewhere unexpected and is still in the process of determining whether it's better or worse than where he was going. "My brother," he said, to nobody in particular. To the room. To whatever version of Clement Farrow existed in the present tense, which was the version that existed inside the people who carried him. Nobody filled the silence. Some silences don't need filling. They need to be exactly as long as they need to be. And then the next thing happens. Farrow looked at the table, at the documents, at the folder. He was 24 years old, he said. He liked baseball. He was bad at it, genuinely, comically bad at it, and he played anyway, every Sunday. with the same enthusiasm he would have brought to being good at it. A pause. Small, deliberate. He wrote letters home every week, even when there was nothing to say. Especially then, nobody moved. "I want Harlan Goss in a federal court," Farrow said. "Not dead, not handled. In a courtroom. With everything on the table, every document, every affidavit, every piece of paper that can be gathered." He looked at Nora. Thomas Weld's name spoken out loud by a federal judge. She looked at him. "That's what I've always wanted," she said. "Then we want the same thing. We want the same thing," she confirmed. Not warmly. Not the conclusion of a friendship forged in a parlor over old documents. The conclusion of a calculation that two separate people had been running in parallel for a bind 24 years, and had just now arrived at the same sum. Farrow looked at Vale. "You're going to cooperate," he said, "completely. Testimony. Documents. Everything in this folder and everything not in it that you remember." "Everything," Vale said. "If you hold anything back. If you find a reason somewhere along the way to decide cooperation is no longer in your interest. If Harlan Goss receives any warning that this is moving." "He won't," Vale said. "Not from me." Farrow held the look for 3 more seconds, measuring. Then he looked at Nora. She gave him the smallest nod. Not endorsement, not absolution, just acknowledgement that the measurement was correct. Farrow turned toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. The gesture she was beginning to understand was simply how he left rooms. Standing for one additional moment in the doorway, giving himself one more chance to revise whatever he'd decided. "Mrs. Weld," he said. "Not turning, Farrow? I've been doing this for 15 years, he said, bringing people in. Working for whoever could pay." A pause. "I'm going to do something different after this." She didn't ask what. It wasn't her question to ask. It was his answer to find in whatever time he had to find it. "Your brother would have been glad," she said instead. He stood in the doorway for one more second, then he walked out. The front door opened, closed. Specific and final, the house settled around her and Garrison Vale. Two people who had been aimed at each other for 13 years and had arrived in the same room and found it emerged differently than either of them had planned for. She organized the documents. Precisely. The care of a woman who has spent 8 years learning that the only appropriate way to handle this kind of information is with deliberate attention and no rushing. Then she stood. "I could still take this to a newspaper," she said. "Your name in it alongside Goss's. The cooperation, the silence, the 30 years of benefit built on a cleared field." She looked at him. "I'm not making promises. I'm not asking for them," he said. "Harlan Goss first. Federal court. Thomas's name spoken out loud. Yes, then we'll see where the rest of it lands." She picked up her bag, moved toward the back door. The way she had come in, at the door she stopped. She looked back at the room, the lamp, the desk, the folder in her hands, the land document still on the table, Garrison Vale in his chair, looking at his hands. The posture of a man who has put something down after carrying it wrong for 30 years, and doesn't yet know what to do with the hands that held it. She stepped through the door. The Nevada night received her, August warmth that didn't apologize for itself. The smell of dry earth and something faintly alive from the cottonwoods to the south. The quiet of a place far enough from light and noise to be itself without interference. She walked south through the thin tree line, and Dust was there, exactly where she'd left him. Head up, ears forward. The calm authority of a horse that had been standing in the dark for 2 hours and had opinions about it that did not include alarm, because she would come back and she had come back, and that was the entirety of the relevant information. She put her hand flat on his neck. He exhaled that specific exhale. The breath of an animal that has been waiting and has received confirmation that the waiting is over. Not relief exactly. Dust didn't do relief, as far as she could tell. Just the adjustment from one state to the next. From waiting to done waiting. The smallest possible transition. She stood there for a moment, hand on his neck. Folder under her other arm. The desert in every direction around her doing what the desert did. Being vast and present, all of it simultaneously, and without any of it interfering with the rest. She thought about Thomas. Not the version of Thomas she thought about most often. Not the grief version. Not the anger version. The other one. The one she got to sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the weight was carried right. The Thomas who had pointed out Polaris on their wedding night in December of 1858 and said, without ceremony, that he thought fixed points were worth finding. The Thomas whose lips moved on the complicated passages. The Thomas who had believed that the law existed to give people the moment of being asked to account, and that when the law failed, the correct response was not to abandon the principle, but to find another way to make it real. Another door. He had been right about that. The door she had spent 8 years building toward had been closed, and another door had opened. Not the one she expected, not in the direction she expected, revealing something more complicated than she had prepared herself for Thomas Weld's signature on a land sale she had been certain never happened. She held that. She didn't know what to do with it yet. Maybe the document was genuine. Maybe Toss had signed it for reasons she hadn't known, for pressures she hadn't been aware of, for calculations he had made, and chosen not to share with her. Married 24 years and still, people kept things. Even the people you knew best kept the things that seemed, in the moment, too difficult to explain. Maybe the document was forged by someone skilled enough to fool 3 examiners. She didn't know. She might never know. And that was the thing about truth, the thing Thomas had understood from 30 years on the bench. Truth was not always available in its complete form. Sometimes you got the partial version, the version with gaps in it, the version where 2 equally possible explanations existed, and the evidence didn't clearly favor either. What you did with the partial version was still your choice. What you did next was still your choice. She mounted dust. He moved south without being asked, always knew south, always knew the direction that was away from the thing that had been resolved, toward whatever came next. She let him choose the pace. She always did. 2 weeks. Maybe 3 Farrow and his federal marshal in San Francisco. Harlan Goss in Sacramento, still doing what he had been doing for 30 years, assembling parcels, moving money, operating in the precise space between what was legal and what was right. Confident that the space was permanent and that nobody would ever look at it directly. They were going to look at it directly. The documents in her saddlebag, the folder from Vale's desk, the affidavits, the dying man's statement, the unsigned letter dated October 1871 that connected 2 deaths and 1 land company and 3 decades of patient maneuvering in the margins of justice. Thomas Weld's name in a courtroom. She held it the way you hold something that has been a long time coming. Not gripping it, just letting it be present, letting it be real, letting it be the thing it was instead of the thing she had imagined it would feel like. It didn't feel like relief. She had expected relief. What it felt like was the crest of a long hill, the moment when the angle of the ground changes and you can see for the first time what the other side looks like. Not easy, not finished, different. The particular quality of a view available only to people who kept walking when walking was difficult. August Pruitt was on the road to Provo. She was almost certain of that. Had been almost certain since the second time he rode away. There were men who's turned around once and kept turning around, and there were men who figured out what needed figuring out and then pointed themselves at home. August was the second kind. She could tell the difference. She hoped the daughter was awake. She hoped the girl heard his horse on the road before he reached the door. She hoped she ran. Kit Howell was against the rail of the Callaway Saloon, with $3 set aside for his marker, 21 years old. She didn't know what he'd been carrying, what weight inherited from which source, in what shape. She only knew that the carrying had bent him toward the kind of hunger that ends one way. She had not been able to put that weight down for him. She had not been able to do anything for him except the thing she'd done, which was the only thing available in the time she had. She let that be the size it was. The dry wash opened ahead of her. She turned dust in. He found the flat ground. She made a small fire, sat beside it and let the night be what it was. The desert, the stars. The quiet available only to people who stop making noise long enough to receive it. She thought about the sentence Vale had said. Most of the time, the things we carry alone until we die, and the weight dies with us. She had been carrying Thomas for 13 years. She had been carrying the land documents and the affidavits and the dying man's statement and the particular conviction that if she was patient enough and thorough enough, the right door would eventually open. And tonight the door had opened. Not the door she built toward another one, that was Thomas actually. That was exactly the kind of thing Thomas would have done. Building something carefully, for years, that turned out to serve a different purpose than the one it was designed for, but served it better. The accidental rightness of thorough preparation. She almost said something out loud to him, stopped herself. Didn't need to. He already knew. She covered the fire, pulled her bedroll. Lay back, the sky above her. Polaris in the north where it always was. The fixed point. The thing that stayed still while everything else wheeled around it. She found it, let her eyes rest on it. Still here, she thought. The fire was out by midnight, not because she put it out. Because small fires in dry washes burn what they have, and then stop, the way honest things do. No drama, no lingering. Just the gradual subtraction of light, until the dark around her was the same dark as the dark everywhere else, and the distinction between fire and no fire became a matter of temperature rather than visibility. She didn't sleep again after the fire went out, didn't try to. She lay on her back with her hands folded on her stomach and looked at the stars the way Thomas had taught her to look at them. Not romantically, not philosophically, but practically, as navigation, as reference, as the original system that people used before they built better ones and then forgot that the better ones could fail. The stars don't fail, Thomas had said. They change position with the seasons, but they don't fail. Learn them the way you learn anything you might need in the dark. She had learned them. 37 years later, she could still name the ones directly overhead, could trace the shapes without trying, the way you trace the layout of a house you grew up in. Not because you're paying attention, but because your body remembered before your mind got involved. Dust stood at the edge of her peripheral vision. She could hear him breathing, the slow measured breath of a horse who has made his peace with standing in the dark and finds it acceptable. She had bought him in the spring of 1870, the year after Thomas died, from a man outside Elko who'd had 3 horses to sell and had tried to interest her in the younger 2. She had looked at all 3 and chosen Dust on the basis of something she couldn't have articulated at the time and could only partly articulate now. He had looked back at her the way very few animals looked back at people, with what seemed like assessment rather than hunger or fear. Like he was running the same calculation she was, like he was deciding if she was worth his time. She must have passed the test, 12 years together now, the kind of relationship that doesn't require explaining because it has accumulated its own language. Weight shifts in the saddle, the angle of an ear, the particular quality of stillness that meant caution versus the different quality that meant rest. She understood him the way you understand something you've spent 12 years paying attention to. Not perfectly, not completely, but well enough that the gaps didn't matter. She thought about Garrison Vale's folder, specifically about Harlan Goss. She had known the name before tonight, peripherally. The way you know the names of men who operate in adjacent spaces. You hear them referenced, you file them away. You don't investigate unless you have a reason. She hadn't had a reason until tonight. Now she had a complete set of reasons and the documentation to support them. Harlan Goss had been operating since the early 1860s. The folder laid it out clearly. Vale's handwriting was precise. The notes of a man who had spent 11 years conducting careful inquiry that he never intended to do anything with, which gave the inquiry a particular quality of thoroughness. When you're not building toward a confrontation, when you're just trying to understand what you're standing in the middle of, you notice different things. You ask different questions. Vale had asked good questions. He had just stopped short of the last one. The land company had 3 principals, 2 dead. Goss was the survivor, which was either coincidence or pattern, and in Nora's experience, the difference between coincidence and pattern was the number of times it happened. 2 times was pattern. Goss had moved from Nevada to Sacramento in 1874. The same year Nora had put down her gun and started building the legal case. She didn't know if that was connected. She didn't know if Goss had any idea she existed or what she was doing. Probably not. She had been careful, the kind of careful that involved changing her name in 4 towns over 8 years and keeping the envelope close and her head down and her horse ready. But possibly Goss had heard something. Possibly one of the threads she'd been pulling had been noticed from the other end, the federal marshal in San Francisco. She ran through what she knew about the office there. It had changed hands twice in the last decade. The current marshal, a man named Aldercott, from correspondence Farrow had referenced, had a reputation she was aware of but hadn't personally tested. Farrow trusted him. Farrow had said the kind who doesn't get bought with the specific confidence of a man who had personally verified the claim. She would trust Farrow's read on Aldercott, for now. Trust being a word she used carefully, and revised readily when the evidence suggested revision. The stars moved or appeared to move, which was the same thing from where she was lying. She thought about the land document. Thomas's signature on the sale, she had been certain never happened. She had been turning it over since Vale placed it on the table, examining it from different angles the way you examine anything that doesn't fit the shape of what you already know. The document was either genuine or an expert word forgery. Vale believed it was genuine. The 3 examiners he'd paid, for the truth rather than a specific answer he'd said, had agreed it was genuine. If it was genuine, if Thomas had actually signed it, then Thomas had sold the land 4 months before he died, without telling her, for reasons she didn't know, and then had started asking questions about the sale. And someone had handled it, which meant Thomas had signed something and then changed his mind about what he'd signed. Had started pulling a thread he'd agreed to leave alone. Had done the thing he was constitutionally incapable of not doing when something didn't add up. Had started asking questions and had paid for it. That was a Thomas she recognized. That was completely a Thomas she recognized. Not the secret, the response to it. The inability to leave something wrong sitting there being wrong. The compulsion to make things add up, to find the unresolved element and resolve it, to keep asking until the picture was complete. He had signed something, regretted it, started asking questions, and someone had handled it. She held that version, tested it, it held weight, it didn't exonerate Vale. Vale had known. Vale had kept quiet and kept the land, and built 30 years on top of that foundation. But it made the shape of what happened different, more complicated, less clean than the version she had been carrying. She had been carrying the version where Thomas was entirely innocent, and Vale was entirely culpable, and the truth was simple and the injustice was clear. That version was probably wrong in at least one significant aspect. The truth was almost certainly more complicated. And that was something Thomas would have understood. He had sat on the bench for 30 years and listened to 30 years of cases where the simple version was wrong in at least one significant aspect, and the complicated version was the only thing that was actually true. He had made his decisions based on the complicated version, the one with the gaps and the contradictions and the two explanations that both held water, until you found the specific fact that favored one over the other. He would have understood that she might never find that specific fact about the land document. He would have understood that you proceed anyway, with what you have, toward what you can establish, without requiring the picture to be complete before you act on the parts you can see clearly. What she could see clearly was Harlan Goss, the land company, the 2 dead principals, the fraudulent signature. Fraudulent or genuine, either way, someone had arranged for Thomas to start asking questions and then arranged for Thomas to stop. Clement Farrow, 24 years old, good at letters and bad at baseball, dead behind a freight office 4 days after Thomas, and for the same reason. She could see that clearly. She intended to act on it. The sky to the east began to change, not dramatically, more like a decision being made incrementally, the dark blue lightening by degrees so gradual that any given moment looked identical to the one before it, and yet the accumulation of those moments was undeniable. Dawn arriving the way patient things arrived, without announcing itself, without rushing. She sat up, her back ached in the specific place it had been aching for 6 years, the consequence of a fall from a different horse in a different dry wash in 1876, the kind of injury that heals incompletely and then lives with you as a permanent reminder that you are not, in fact, made of the same material as the country you ride through. She rolled the bedroll, packed the saddlebag, put on her hat. Dust turned his head toward her at the sound of movement, ears forward. Watching, I know, she said. His ears moved once and settled. She checked the saddlebag methodically. The documents, the folder from Vale's desk, the envelope with the affidavits and the dying man's statement, the smaller envelope with the travel money and the list of names. Lawyers in San Francisco she'd identified over the years. A journalist in Carson City she'd researched. The senator's office address in Washington. The gun. The extra cartridges. The tin of hardtack that was mostly powder by now, but still technically food, everything in its place. She saddled Dust with the economy of someone who has performed this particular sequence of actions several thousand times and has eliminated every unnecessary motion. Not fast, efficient. There was a difference, and the difference mattered more at 58 than it had at 30. She mounted, sat still for a moment the way she always did, taking stock. Not of what she had, she knew what she had, of where she was. The dry wash, the fading stars, the road to the east that would eventually connect to the road to San Francisco, or the road to Sacramento, depending on which decision came first. The decision came to her, the way decisions came after a long enough night, not as a conclusion of deliberate reasoning, but as a recognition of something already decided. She had been going to San Francisco before tonight. The destination hadn't changed. What had changed was what she was bringing and what she was asking for. Before tonight, she had been going with a case against Garrison Vale and a request for a federal judge to hear it. Now she was going with a case against Harlan Goss and Vale's testimony and Farrow's federal marshal. And the accumulated weight of 2 deaths and 30 years and a folder of careful inquiry compiled by a guilty man who had finally decided that guilt without action was no longer something he could maintain the weight of. That was more than she'd had yesterday morning. She turned Dust east. He moved without comment into the lightening dark. The road from the wash to the main track was 400 yards of uneven ground that Dust navigated by instinct, picking his footing without requiring direction, the occasional shift of his weight communicating what he'd found before his feet communicated it to her. She let him navigate. She all-wired him navigate the parts he was better at navigating. The main road was empty at this hour. The particular emptiness of a road that connects places people go but isn't itself a place anyone stays. She turned east on it and let Dust find his distance pace, the long, measured stride that wasn't fast but covered ground, the stride that could be sustained for 10 hours without destroying him, the stride that got you where you were going. The sky continued its incremental argument toward morning. She thought about August Pruitt riding north toward Provo, and a daughter who was 7 years old, or 8. The daughter watching a window, the way children watch windows, when they had been promised something was coming, the faith of a child who believed in the return, because nobody had given her a reason not to yet. She hoped August got there before that faith was tested. She thought about Dex Farrow riding toward San Francisco with 15 years of professional habits, and the specific fresh purpose of a man who has just been given a legitimate target for a grief he's been carrying in the wrong direction. Clement Farrow, 24 years old. Letters home every week, even when there was nothing to say. Harlan Goss was going to be looked at directly. He didn't know that yet. He was in Sacramento right now, doing whatever he did at this hour. Sleeping, probably, the sleep of a man who had convinced himself that what he'd done was sufficiently far in the past to have stopped being relevant. The particular sleep of men who had arranged for there to be no witnesses and had concluded from the absence of consequence that consequence was no longer possible. They were always wrong about that. Consequence had a different relationship with time than most people understood. It didn't move in straight lines. It didn't arrive on schedule. It accumulated in the places it had been stored, and then arrived all at once, in a form and at a moment that the person waiting for it had usually stopped watching for by then. The road ran east, Dust ran with it. The sun broke the horizon, not gradually, but in the sudden definitive way of a thing that has been building toward a threshold and crosses it. One moment the sky was the color of approaching light. The next moment the sun was there, full and immediate, the Nevada summer sun that didn't apologize and didn't wait. She pulled her hat brim down, rode into it anyway. 58 years old, 13 years of this particular road. One folder, one set of affidavits, one dying man's statement, and the names of 3 men who could move the machinery that Thomas had believed in and served and died for. She was going to put the names and the documents in front of the machinery. And then she was going to wait. Because that was what she did. Because patience was not, as the young believed, the absence of urgency. Patience was urgency that had learned to carry itself quietly, over distances that required more than a sprint, toward destinations that required more than arrival. Thomas had known that. She had learned it from watching him. Dust moved beneath her, steady. East, the desert opened around her the way Nevada opened at sunrise. Generously, as if the scale of it was the only honest way to be. She gave him the long rein. He took it, and they rode east together into the morning that had been coming all night, the way mornings did, without fanfare, without permission, arriving because that was what they did and had always done, and would continue to do, long after every concern currently being carried beneath them had reached its resolution, one way or another. She intended it to be the right way, for Thomas, for Clement Farrow. 24 years old and bad at baseball, for the daughter in Provo who deserved to grow up in a country where this kind of thing got answered for the principle that Thomas had served 30 years and that she had been serving in her own way for 13. The West does not forgive slow women. She had known that for 30 years. What she understood now, what had taken 13 years and a dead husband and a dead boy and a dry wash and 2 pieces of paper she hadn't expected, and a man in a parlor who had been carrying the wrong weight in the wrong direction for 3 decades, was that the West also did not forgive the men who bet on a patient woman getting tired. She had not gotten tired. She was not going to. There was a courtroom somewhere east of this dry wash, with an empty seat that had been waiting for 13 years. She was going to fill it. The stars turned overhead. Dust breathed in the dark Pensteady, still there, and so was she. The road ran east. She ran with it.